Today, South Africa enters level 4 of the nationwide lockdown. Basically, it means certain businesses may open, but under very strict hygiene and staff safety conditions. There's also a strict nightly curfew from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. the following morning. Wearing a mask in public is now mandatory, and certain exercise, such as jogging and cycling, is also permitted between 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. only within a 5K radius of your residence. In addition, restaurants and fast food outlets are allowed to open, but only for deliveries and no sit-in meals. Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Minister says this. There's, of course, been anger from some at the continued ban on the sale of alcohol and cigarettes. So our next guest has been very vocal about government's response to the lockdown, and that's political analyst Professor Steven Friedman, who joins us now. Great to have you, Prof. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Leah.
So, as I mentioned, you've been critical of the lockdown policies, saying that those in the inside know what's going on, and it's a guessing game for the rest of us. Do you want to elaborate a bit?
Well, that's correct, Leah. Look, I think there are two things here. The first one is that if you look at our regulations, they are still among the strictest. I think they're probably the strictest in the world. I don't know anywhere else where people are told that they can't buy cigarettes. I don't know anywhere else where people are told that you can't go for a walk after 9 o'clock in the morning. So that's the first problem. The second problem, as you correctly say, is that the whole process is confused. On the one hand, we're told that there's this incredibly complicated and efficient system in which you go from level 5 to level 4, and everything is catered for. On the other hand, what we see in practice is that it's all put up for negotiation between the politicians and between them and interest groups, etc., and so you have total confusion. As far as I would argue that the reason we have the strictest rules in the world is, to put it very bluntly, that the government doesn't trust its own citizens, and particularly those citizens who in the main vote for it, which is very ironic, because it really believes that if you allow anything really beyond what they're allowing, then people in the townships and the shack settlements would abuse it. I don't think that's true, but I think that's the government's thinking. Yeah. And then on the second hand, you have this, to put it frankly, this on the one hand, that very strong desire to show that you're sophisticated, you can control, you've got everything catered for, but then you haven't got everything catered for, because, you can change your mind and you can allow this interest group to persuade you and that interest group to persuade you. So all in all, it doesn't lead to a very effective situation, and as you correctly say, it leads to one in which citizens land up either angry or confused.
If we look at you say up for negotiation, isn't that what this is all about? I mean, what we've constantly been told, and we see it in different parts of the world, is that something like this has never happened before, and we sort of are almost making up the rules as we go along. Can we not understand that? Is that perhaps a good enough reason as to why the decisions are changed and chopped to try and make or try to move with the situation?
You see, Leanne, what is happening is obviously it's a new situation, etc., but it depends on how you approach it. I mean, you can either have an approach which says, look, we'll use common sense, we'll see as things, we'll try this and we'll try that as things go along, which is the way in which it's been done in many other places. So in other words, you say, okay, from the following date, we're opening the following stores, and we're allowing you to do the following things, and we'll see how it works out, and if it works out, that we won't reimpose the restrictions. That is what I would call a common sense approach. We haven't gone for the common sense approach. It's been complicated beyond measure with, 5 levels and large, flow charts and heaven knows what else. And that's a problem in itself. But if really, at the end of the day, you can't really implement any of those flow charts because, you know that if you do, the cigarette manufacturers will take you to court, or the anti-smoking people will take you to court, or whatever the case may be, then you land up neither here nor there. And I think that there's the root of that problem is the belief in government, which is expressed in the way in which ministers talk at press briefings, etc., that, you can control this whole process. It's precisely because, as you correctly say, that it's a new process, that you can't control the whole process. I mean, let me give you an example, which I thought really stood out. At the other night's briefing, Minister Patel, in effect, announced that the government had decided to delay the peak of the epidemic in South Africa from June until September. Now, for heaven's sake, this is a totally new virus. Nobody in the world knows how it operates. You don't delay a peak by some sort of government decision. The virus does not, the virus is not compliant with the National Command Council. So, I mean, to me, that's very revealing. If you actually believe that you are so in control that you can tell a virus when it peaks or not, but at the other hand, you are not actually sure whether people are allowed to smoke cigarettes or when they're allowed to jog, then you're really sending very unfortunate mixed signals to the citizen.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, let's talk to mixed signals because, when the president spoke to South Africa telling us we're moving into level 4 and that cigarettes would be allowed and you would be able to buy them, then there was a sudden U-turn on the cigarette policy. And let's talk to this confusion, saying that just a few thousand, 2,000 to be specific, I can't even speak, are the majority in the matter. I think that was what the minister said. People who said no to the resumption of cigarette sales, 2,000 people. Talk to us about what you think is going on with regard to cigarettes.
Well, to be very blunt, what is going on is there's a dispute within government, which we're very familiar with in this country. There are some people in the government who want cigarettes to be sold. There are other people in government who don't want cigarettes to be sold. And what the people who don't want cigarettes to be sold have done is, as you correctly say, claim, which is what the Minister of Cooperation, Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs did, is to say, well, it's not her. It's that she would never dream of changing a decision. It's the people. But it's not the people. It's 2,000 people, which, as I pointed out yesterday, most of the time 2,000 people doesn't win you a municipal by-election, let alone represent the majority of South Africans. So what, in effect, you're doing is that, you're using fake public opinion, which is 2,000 people, as an excuse for the fact that you're divided within government as usual, and you can't agree. And what obviously happened is that it was discussed in the Command Council. The majority vote was for allowing cigarettes to be sold. And those people who lost the majority vote said, well, let's put public pressure on in this way by using the 2,000 people who respond. And somehow that lands up in winning. And of course, it sends very unfortunate messages. First of all, the confusion we've been talking about. But secondly, I suspect also the feeling about people that they're not being taken seriously. Adult South Africans know that 2,000 people, incidentally 2,000 out of 70,000 who are supposed to have sent messages to the government, that isn't a majority and that people are playing politics. So it also leads to the situation where I think one of the purposes of this fancy scientific model with the 5 levels is to try and take everything out of the range of politics within the government. And of course it's failed because at the end of the day, politics within government is a reality, and unless you manage it, it doesn't go away. Yeah.
You mentioned it in your opinions. You also said it at the beginning of the interview that government is clearly convinced that it needs to be tough on people, particularly in townships and shack settlements, because what you say is that they don't know how to look after their own health. And this in a way is extremely condescending. So if we look a little bit further into that, the lockdown, is it perhaps an inequality issue? It's then more addressed towards keeping township dwellers and, as you say, informal settlements in order as opposed to everywhere else. These rules, what do you think?
Absolutely. In my view, that's precisely what it's about. And sometimes people say things which in government, which gives the game away, which let the cat out of the bag. So Minister Dlamini Zuma the other night, when she was announcing that there would be a ban on cigarettes, said, well, there's this habit among our people, and our people is code for people who live in townships and shack settlements, where they get together and they share cigarettes, and you can't have this in a pandemic. So, it's not about some person in the suburb who goes into the supermarket and buys a pack of cigarettes. It's somebody who buys them from the spice shop. Secondly, when the ban on hot food was enforced, in effect, Minister Patel said, well, we can't allow suburban supermarkets to sell hot food because then the ladies on street corners who buy pop and steak can also do that. So, what this is trying to do is stop the ladies on the street corners selling pop and steak, stopping the people in shack settlements sharing their cigarettes. And as you correctly say, that's deeply condescending. But there is no evidence at all that I'm aware of which suggests that because if you're poor and you live in a shack settlement, you don't want to protect yourself from a horrible virus, and you're not willing to comply with public health. The problem we all know is that the reason people in shack settlements and townships very often don't comply is that they can't comply because their living circumstances simply don't allow you to comply in the way in which we folks in the suburbs can comply. That's a real problem that has to be dealt with. But it's not dealt with by condescending, and it's not dealt with by patronizing people, and it's not dealt with by assuming that people in townships and shack settlements are so ignorant and so self-destructive that if you leave them alone, with more appropriate regulations, they will cause a catastrophe. Yeah. Incidentally, I think this has been a problem in the way we've been governed since 1994. I think that, despite all the nice-sounding talk of democracy and, we're all part of the same wonderful South Africa together, I think across the board politicians in this country tend to have a very dim view of people who are living in poverty, and this is reflected in the way we're handling the lockdown.
Yeah. Just finally, as I wrap up the interview and we move into news, Professor Friedman, the talk of opening up schools, and yesterday obviously we got a little bit more clarity. The 1st of June is the provisional date for grade 7 and grade 12 to perhaps return to school next week. We see teachers and administrators going in and trying to set up schools. We also saw higher education talking to online learning. You talk about these the lack of deliveries from 1994. I mean, is this, feasible? The kind of rules that have been put in place for South Africans to abide by, and now the education system is very much so under threat this entire academic year. What are your views on what's going on there?
Well, I think it illustrates some of the points that I'm making. You see, I mean, part of the problem here is that you say that you're sensitive to public opinion when it's 2,000 people saying what you want to hear, but you're not sensitive to public opinion when it comes to something massive like opening schools. I mean, they may have been they were going to open them next week. Now, I made the point that unused in this country because that's the way we operate. Most proposals being hotly debated and people taking positions on both sides. I haven't come across any member of the South African public who thinks that opening schools in the next while or so is a good idea. The trade unions have made it clear, the teachers' unions, that they don't think it's a good idea. On the one hand, having told everybody that you're so sensitive to public opinion that 2,000 people can get you to change the ban on cigarettes, you're not sensitive enough to public opinion to go and find out what the teachers' unions and the learners' parents feel about you bringing people back to school. Secondly, I mean, the proposals, as far as I can see, are entirely unrealistic. I mean, quite frankly, in a situation where we quite rightly, when we queue to go into our shops to buy food or whatever the case may be, are expected to keep social distancing. You say that pupils can sit, learners can sit two to a desk. Then you clearly are sending those mixed signals again. And quite frankly, as Professor Karim, who of course is the scientific advisor on this thing, has pointed out repeatedly, as soon as the schools open, the problem is not so much whether the young people are going to get infected, because thank heaven around the world young people of that age usually don't come to any great harm. The point is that they will go home and they will infect their families. So you can't open schools until until you are absolutely certain that you can reassure teachers and parents that they're safe in those schools. And quite frankly, I've not seen any evidence so far that any South African teacher or parent can be sure that the schools are only going to open when their children are safe.
Prof. Friedman, we thank you very, very much for your time talking to us about different views about the lockdown here in South Africa, how he feels about it, and of course the opening of schools as well. We'll leave it there.